To move on now, we will continue with comments on the topic from Ms. Nivine Sandouka. She's an activist aspiring to achieve social justice, peace, and gender equity. She's an expert in the field of program development, management, peace building, and gender issues. To pursue her passion, she's an executive director of a newly established NGO called Our Rights, حقوقنا, focusing on civil and political rights of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, especially women. Ms. Nivine, please.
Hi. So most of us are tired, so I'll try to keep this short and focused. But thank you very much. I read the policy paper that was sent to us, and I'd like to focus on some of the issues in a deeper sense. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. To start with, I think we need to understand the complexity of the situation for women in East Jerusalem. So, and this complexity is actually made up of several layers. I'll start with the first one, that we are always speaking on the assumption that East Jerusalem is one unit, that Palestinians in East Jerusalem are all the same, which is not the case. East Jerusalem is divided into different towns and villages, and each one of those have its own unique context. And in addition to that, the East Jerusalem population is made up of different families and different origins. But we are all united under the same national identity, Palestinians. To give you an example, we have Jerusalemites who have origin in Jerusalem, Jerusalemites who came from Hebron, some who actually came from the villages around Jerusalem. And why is it important for us to know that? Because if we put East Jerusalem in one pot and say East Jerusalem, we tend to be marginalizing some groups and their uniqueness. So it's really important to make this differentiation. The other thing is that it's also important to know that because even though these groups share, as I said, the same national identity, but in terms of gender and women's rights, some of these groups offer more equitable opportunities to women and freedoms, while others tend to be more traditional and apply more control on women's choices. The other complexity that we need to understand, which I felt was maybe tackled a little bit in the presentation, is actually the economy, the economic aspect. If you go back to the slides, there was one slide where the woman, the Palestinian women specifically, had the highest rating or the highest votes for employment. And why is that? Because in general, as per the statistics, it showed that 70% of the Palestinians in East Jerusalem live under the poverty line. Within that 70%, only 12% of the women in East Jerusalem work. So you can imagine large families, again, we're not generalizing, but it's good to look at the trends, large families of 5 children with only one breadwinner. And usually that breadwinner works in a place where he gets maybe the minimum wage of maybe 5,000 and something shekels. They rent a house rentals, minimum, they start at $700. How much is that in shekels? 3,000?
Yeah.
3,000 shekels. So out of that salary, 3,000 shekels goes to rent, and the rest, of course, electricity, water, food, and so they remain under the same under the poverty line all the time. Now, for a woman in East Jerusalem to get a decent job, and by decent job, I'm not referring to the Wisconsin plan or all these plans that basically would, when a woman goes and she says, okay, I'm looking for a job, and they refer her to cleaning or like in a factory that she cannot reach because there are no transportation to reach that factory, or in a place that requires Hebrew and she doesn't know Hebrew, by a decent job, she needs, first of all, education beyond high school. However, due to the different social, economic, and underdeveloped educational system in East Jerusalem, the vast majority of women will not come close to getting a good education. Looking at percentages, 70% of working-age women do not have more than a high school education. Indeed. And 44% have not even completed 12 years of education. The East Jerusalem women who manage to enter the labor market often find themselves doing hard physical work in temporary jobs under abusive conditions. Apart from humiliation, such work worsens their entrampment in poverty cycle. Even among jobs in the educational system, health, and care of the elderly, we find deeply entrenched practices of abusive employment. There are right now many stories coming up of teachers who work in schools in East Jerusalem, and these schools are getting money from the municipality, from the Jerusalem municipality. But what is the trick? The trick basically is that you don't give those teachers a contract. They work for 3 months and then you let them go. That's one. The second story that's coming up right now is about sexual harassment in some of those schools as well. And the principal, who usually controls and have the power, threatens those teachers that if you speak up, you will lose your job. So they remain silent. And of course, because it's a fadiha. Fadiha in English means, somebody help me, what is fadiha? Scandal, thank you. Of course, let's look at other obstacles that women in East Jerusalem face if they actually want to leave their house and be active participants. So there's a chronic lack of daycare centers for their small children. There were stories when a woman couldn't leave her child anywhere, so she took him or her to her work. She got fired the very next day. A severe issue with public transportation, which was noted in Timaya's paper. So basically, we need to understand that there are two different systems of transportation in Jerusalem. There is the one in East Jerusalem, which you cannot buy or you cannot use the card, which you actually purchase to use the public transport in West Jerusalem. So every time you need to go on a public transport in East Jerusalem, you have to buy a new ticket, which if you are already under the poverty line, that puts burden on you. On top of that, most of the women don't know how to use the Western public transport. They don't know the names of the places, how to get there. So sometimes they have to rent a taxi, and taxis are like 40 shekels each ride. That's the minimum. So that puts another burden on them. And of course, in some parts, it was reported that there were harassment from bus drivers, especially the Palestinian system. And as mentioned as well, time is not clear, so you cannot really schedule your time as well. The system in East Jerusalem doesn't reach all the places. If you are employed, let us say, in the industrial area, it's really difficult to find a transport system from East Jerusalem that takes you to that place. I think in one of the sessions it was mentioned that it's important to have a transport system that runs across the city, a unified one. Now, another very important factor that we need to consider is the separation from the West Bank by checkpoints and the wall. It means that a majority of Palestinians, if you remember the keynote speaker this morning, he showed a figure which was 300-something% of the growth of East Jerusalemites. If you remember that or not, over the years, it was like the majority, it was 8% Christians, 300 and something Muslims, and 160, I think, Jews, the percentage of growth. And if you think, why is that? It's because Palestinians in East Jerusalem cannot really leave East Jerusalem, because if you leave East Jerusalem, you won't be able to come back. Your residency will be provoked, and your rights, your welfare, healthcare will all be provoked, so you prefer to live under or in this very small space, which means more crowded, more social issues. If you look at the drug abuse, it's a very high rate and alarming rate in Jerusalem. I'm wondering why it didn't come up so strong, because there is, but there's no specific data about it. But if you ask Palestinians in East Jerusalem, they will tell you drug dealers have a deal with the Israeli police. That yes, they want the Palestinians to be addicts, drug addicts, but as long as you're doing it in East Jerusalem, that's okay. Don't come to West Jerusalem. Yeah. And then that's a problem. I'm almost finished, thank you. And of course, one of the most important issues is the language barrier. they don't teach us in school Hebrew. And they don't teach in West Jerusalem, they don't teach them Arabic either. So there's a problem. Of course, it's very important to remember that in East Jerusalem, you live under a very patriarchal system. So as a woman, I'm not only subject to the occupation policies, but I'm also subject of patriarchal control. And I'll give you an example of that. There is, maybe last year, most of you maybe who live here have heard about the woman who committed suicide in Sur Bahir, or Jabal al-Mukabbar, one of those. So basically, why did she commit suicide? Somebody took photos of her, they manipulated her to pay money. Otherwise, those photos in inappropriate positions will be on the internet. So she didn't tell her family, because it's a patriarchal society, they will blame her. She didn't go to the Israeli police, because if she went to the Israeli police, she would be viewed as a traitor and collaborator. So she didn't go. And then she started taking money slowly from her husband and then from her family. And by the end, she committed suicide. And she wrote a letter of why she committed suicide. Another thing is that is also related to violence against women in East Jerusalem. So again, there is a large percentage of violence against women. And I'm talking about abuse from maybe the family or from the husband. But basically, again, they do not approach the Israeli police or the protection system that exists. And they don't know about the protection system that exists in the West Bank either. Now, if you try to approach the Israeli police, and you see this all the time on social media, traitor, collaborator, she should be silent, she should deal with it, and things like that. Another issue is the political Islam and how they're using women as a method of control, especially in Jerusalem. The West Bank, the Palestinian Authority are kind of controlling this. But in Jerusalem, they are allowed to use women as a method of control. Wear your hijab, don't go out and work, don't participate in public activities. That said, I'm going to talk a little bit about political participation. I'll try to finish it in 2 minutes. So with all these problems for any woman, it's really difficult to think that I want to be politically active. Political participation will rank the least on my priority list. But there are 2% of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, women, who are highly educated. And throughout the history, let us say, we have seen some of these women who are educated, who have the financial means, also finally step up and take some political roles as well. You mentioned civil society. I don't think civil society is doing enough. I think there's actually a gap between civil society and the grassroots level. I think it's really important to focus on economic empowerment of women. But the question is, are there jobs for these women after they take these courses? And if they, start producing, are there markets for them? Do they still, have the language to work? I finished. Thank you. And the last thing, I think it's important to focus on awareness-raising campaigns, on the rights of women, on what it means to live in East Jerusalem, the political rights, the economic rights, and to work with also men, not only women. And by that, I'll finish, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Nivine. I think one thing that I would like to add to the things that you've mentioned about what women in East Jerusalem suffer from is gender-based violence that Palestinian women face in East Jerusalem from the Israeli forces during home evictions, detainment of prisoners, and for different political reasons.